All right, Sam, today let's chat about creating business results through training.
Let's do it. Let's do
Your
it.
favorite topic.
Thing. My favorite topic ever.
Nice. Yeah, so we had this experience, you and I, with Piada, Italian restaurant brand out of Columbus last year, came into this year. For people who don't know about sort of what that project was, why don't you just break it down for us, kind of start from the beginning?
Yeah, it ended up being a really big project from a training perspective. But it started with the goal that they had. And I think like when you talk about driving results, that's where you've got to start. And so their whole goal was to increase guest NPS. It was all customer service, hospitality focused, but their whole goal was to increase the guest NPS. And so
Net promoter score for the layman.
Net promoter score. Yes. The guest net promoter score. And they were measuring it. They had data around it. And, hospitality was one of the core pillars of the brand. Like from the origins, way back when it started, hospitality was at the core. It's how they talked about it. But then when they came to us, they were like, hey, it's part of our ethos as a brand. And yet we're not delivering at the level that we want. Like the guest NPS scores aren't as high as we would want them to be for being a brand focused on hospitality. And so we believe training's at the core of that. We want to make sure that all of our teams know what it is, how to do it. And that really started everything that you and I did with them together for a long time. But that was the core of it, was how do we increase the guest NPS?
Yeah. And so they had a very clear and specific goal starting out, which it feels too obvious to say, but like that has to be the place to start. It's like a clear, measurable goal, right?
100%. Like to deliver any results through training, you got to know what results you're going after, which seems obvious to say, but you can't do it without it. So you got to start there.
Yeah. So what was so walk us through sort of those first steps early on. We met with Corbin, who was the then head of training, now VP of Restaurant Excellence. What was that process like of kind of kicking off that project?
Yeah, he started with the goal of what he wanted to do. He knew he needed to teach people. And so where we started was like, okay, so what are you teaching them today? Like, what does training look like? What are the standards that you have in place today? To almost do an audit of like, okay, if that's your goal and you want to be at a certain NPS, how are you teaching your teams to get there today? And then we can kind of fill in the gaps. And so we started all the way back with him of like, how are you teaching it? What are you using? What mechanisms do you have to teach, to then start to come up with a plan? And so we learned that he had iPads in the restaurants to be able to teach. He had, was it 40-ish restaurants when we started this?
45 plus.
Yeah, multiple states, but only like 2 dedicated trainers. So it's basically a new restaurant opening team was the train. So it's not like there's trainers floating around teaching this stuff. And so we kind of mapped out the org and what they had to figure out like, okay, how do you do this at scale? Like one is we can create the standards and create the training. But the more important thing is how do you deliver that in a way that works for that company? And in that case, you've got 2 trainers who are focused on opening new restaurants. You've got 3 or 4 states of restaurants. They had Ohio, Texas, they were opening North Carolina. And so like, you kind of define the problem and the challenge. And I think for you and I, that was like, this is the box we've got to work within before we ever start talking about training. It's like, what is the problem that you're facing? And let's help you solve that problem. Once we figured out, all right, how many states are you in? What technology do you have? Who's going to teach the stuff? Then we started getting into, well, what exactly are we going to teach?
Yeah.
And I think you and I spent, how long do you think we spent? We spent a long time just on what are the right standards. That felt like a multi-week process, but that was where we spent a lot of time up front, was what are the standards going to be?
Yeah. Building out that kind of standard and framework for genuine, how do you define genuine hospitality within a brand? Because they wanted to deliver on, a warm, welcoming environment, speedy service, because it's a fast casual place, get people through the line really quickly, get that really good flow. And also providing delicious food. And so we really built the framework around those three elements, around speed of service, around dynamic hospitality, the feeling they create in the restaurant, and serving delicious, safe, consistent food. So we really dove into those three areas and developed a series of standards. That the thing that when I look back that I love about introducing a framework is that it created this shared language within the restaurant.
Yeah.
You got people. You got people going around saying like, "Hey, are you ready? Are you ready for work? Are you?" I'm trying to. Yeah, I can't think of the other things on the top of my mind, but asking themselves the questions.
Check was a big one.
Yeah, triple double check. When you introduce these concepts, these frameworks that ladder up to the standards that you're trying to teach, it creates shared language and makes it really, really easy for managers to teach. And that was really cool to see how that just kind of just became an ingrained part of their culture throughout the process.
I think so. And like that, the back and forth on that, I remember we just had Google Sheets going of like, because there's a million ways to define, to get to the framework of like, well, what do we want it to include? A lot of restaurants have a lot of common things, right? Like when you talk about hospitality, it's like smiling and making eye contact and greeting people. Like those are some of the obvious ones. But what was cool with Corbin was we went back and forth a lot of like, well, what are you seeing at Piada? Like, what are the sticking points when you look at your guest feedback or your NPS, where it's like, these are top things that guests are talking about that we're not delivering on. And so you can almost use the feedback that guests were giving to help us create standards of like, oh, we should teach people that we're missing on this a lot. We should talk about, I think for them, one of the big ones was takeout orders.
Yeah.
Like it was brand new. It was just post-COVID. They had a lot of orders coming through takeout. And it was like, we're slow. Like we are not keeping up with it. And that's the bulk of the orders. And so if the goal is to increase guest NPS, what are the things that guests are saying that's dragging it down? So it was a little bit of like, what's industry standard, smiling and making eye contact, but then what's back to the problem you're trying to solve? What are guests complaining about? Let's make sure the standards include those so that we kind of get rid of the negative almost. Let's get all of the negative comments down to zero. That'll leave only good comments, was kind of the goal we took through it too.
Yeah. And I think, the thing that separated this whole program from just being the difference between this being a course and a program in my mind, right? Because this was a training program versus just it wasn't just hey, take this e-learning course. There was just multiple tiers to it and levels. Walk us through those levels and those tiers. What made this a true program versus just a course?
Yeah, I think as we were just talking, this was not the intent when we did it, but I think like we just described what did Simon Sinek call them? It was like the golden circles.
Yeah.
But I think what we just described was that where we started with the why.
Yeah.
We started with, hey, we're trying to increase guest NPS. And this is why we believe this is core to the brand. Like that's where Corbin came from. And then you and I spent a bulk of the time on, well, how? The how really matters of how are we going to deliver this before we got to the what. And I think with a lot of training courses, you start with like, hey, we want to get better at customer service. So let's create a training course and let's train people on customer service. So you go to the what immediately and you deliver the thing and it's like, hey, we delivered the course. And it's like, yeah, but no one changed behaviors. No one delivered results. And so what happened, like you mentioned the tiers, what allowed us to create these tiers of delivery was I think we started with the why. And then when we defined that how, that became the most important thing because we realized a few things in the how. And this led to the delivery of it, which was 3 different states. You've got layers of leadership that are around that need to be brought into this conversation. You've got new restaurants being open frequently. And then you've got all the existing 40-ish restaurants that are operating today. All of those folks need different training, need a different message, need different communication. And so by starting with what are the constraints and how does it work, we were able to design what we built to fit all of those audiences from the get-go. And so the way that it ended up working was we built the courses just like you would imagine. We had sweet videos that were in e-learning courses and SCORM compliant. Like, great, check the box. We did that.
Check.
But then we brought it back up and we said, okay, in order for this to be effective, we've got to roll this out effectively. So we
Yeah.
started all the way back up with Corbin and the senior most leaders at Piada to say, okay, let's make sure we're all on board. And they were giving feedback on the content before it ever rolled out to say, does this message align? Is this content in line with who we are, how we want to operate, and what we want every restaurant to do going forward? We started there, edited the content, and then got that right. And then we released it to the next layer down. So we went to a market partner meeting out in Columbus. He had all of his leaders there together for a normal ops meeting. And we spent an hour saying, okay, here's what we're doing. And Corbin had teed them up beforehand, but then you and I came in and we gave our presentation on this is the framework. And this is why we believe it. We believe we can be best in class at guest hospitality. Here's everything that we're teaching. Here's everything that's in the course. Here's what it looks like. Here's the thought and the idea behind it. And for the leaders, it didn't just have them take the course. We gave them insight into why the courses were built the way that they were built and how they were designed to solve the problem that they all wanted to solve. We're going to increase guest NPS by teaching these standards. And these standards will increase these levers of the guest experience, which will net to a better guest NPS. So we kind of got their buy-in to it, but that was a very different message than what you bring to the next layer down. Because then each of them were bought in. They're like, okay, I want to increase guest NPS. That's a core part of kind of their standards as a market partner or a field leader, depending on what you all call it in restaurants, like the folks that oversee multiple restaurants.
Yeah,
they're bought in.
Director.
Yeah, and now they're bought in. So now they go to their GMs. We had a totally different training for the GMs. So we created a separate package to say, okay, general manager of restaurants, just focus on, I think we started with the just hospitality. So don't focus on going fast. Don't focus on the food for right now. Just focus on kind of the hospitality customer service elements of this.
And eliminating detractors. Start with eliminating the detractors, like you mentioned earlier. Yeah,
totally. And that was the whole thing, was like, just narrow it in, focus right here. And that was the whole, we built in-store trackers, like tools that go in the back of the house that relate to the training. So it's like, take the training, have your people take the training, and each week track your negative comments with the goal of getting to zero. Get to zero negative comments. And every week, that's all they did. And so you go from this like really philosophical message at the field leader, market partner level down to very tactical for GMs of like, you got a lot of stuff going on. Just get your negative comments to zero. Focus on that week over week over week. And what started to happen, and then we had a whole separate package for new restaurant openings of like, oh, we have 40 people we need to train at one time. Whole different package for that world to get 40 people taught the standards from the beginning out of the gate. So, I mean, that's where you kind of have to design it for different audiences and then you let it run. And what we started to see that, like, this is where the magic comes in of you have the leadership bought in. You've got general managers with weekly to-do lists to really bring this to life. You have new restaurant openings starting with this from the beginning. And you saw an immediate spike because by eliminating the negative guest responses, their NPS increased, was it 50%?
Oh, this is the drum roll. This is the drum roll moment right here.
First 6 months, a 50% increase in their guest NPS. They've kept it going. So over the course of the first year, they were hovering in, for those unfamiliar with NPS, it's a negative 100 to positive 100 rating. So positive 100 being the best. They were hovering when we started in the 50s.
The 50s, yeah.
40s, 50s.
Their goal was 80.
Exactly. And they jumped to, in the first 6 months, they jumped to 60s, 70s. Like we were killing it, and it's kept going up, and they're hovering well above 80 now across the company. So across multiple states, multiple locations, but they stayed on it. And that was the thing, was like, it wasn't a course that they rolled out one week and then they rolled out a new menu item the next week. It was like, no, we're going to focus week after week on eliminating negative guest responses. And every restaurant, every market partner was bought into it. Every manager was bought into it. And then you could see the results happen over time. And then it culminated. The coolest part that they did was like, they celebrated it. They made it part of the culture. Like we went probably a year later, you and I went back to Columbus and like filmed the video of their best people to celebrate it and highlight it for, was it one of their manager conferences? I think
Yeah,
it
I got to
was.
go to their manager conference and celebrate some of the best in hospitality, and and also just hear and share the results and get to hear some of the stories of how they had developed hospitality and how they were building this culture of hospitality within the brand, kind of rebuilding because it had been at their core, like you mentioned, for so long. But even since that manager conference, those numbers have continued to increase and continue to go up, and that's what's just remarkable to me is that they've been able to sustain those results because so often, even when you have a well thought out training program, and we have all the elements like we just talked about, a lot of times you see it, this big spike and then a big drop. But they've been able to see the spike and then maintain those results throughout the course of like over the last year, which is a testament to their teams kind of really embracing this.
I think so. So it's hard because it's, we talk about driving results a lot in a restaurant, and it can be really complicated. Like everything we just talked through, it takes a lot to do it. But the reality is, like, I don't think I've ever released a course in my career. I've been doing this for 20 years. No course ever changes results on its own. Singular. It's impossible. Like it's to really change results. And especially when you have like 40 restaurants across states, it's a complicated answer. And so it takes being really thoughtful about what's the goal, what are the constraints, like how do we need this to operate within our environment, and then the content to marry up to that. It takes all of that working together really well, and then sustaining it over time, a commitment from the organization to stick with it and not just like have it be a 1-week initiative, but all of that to really drive results.
That's awesome. That sounds like a great place to put a bow on this conversation.
That's right. It's a fun one though. Piada was a good one on, great story on how to actually, I think everybody wants to increase guest experience or drive a better customer service. So a cool story of how to do it.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks for sharing. And, well, until next time.
Until next time.